Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. Before we get started with the interview, if you haven't heard, I've started a Patreon account for the podcast. Patreon is a way for you to help support the show and get special rewards in return, such as a thank you shout out on the show and an enamel button with the Queer Spirit logo. This year, I've also added access to videos of the podcast interviews and a free monthly live virtual sound bath. So today I'd like to offer a shout out of gratitude to our most recent donors. We have Timothy Gage and Myra Alejandro. Thank you so much for supporting the show and helping us to bring queer spirit to folks everywhere. If you'd like to join in supporting the show, just go to patreon.com/queer spirit. You can also find the link in the show notes. Any Patreon funds remaining after the basic production costs will be donated to nonprofits supporting diverse queer communities. Once again, that link is patreon.com/queer spirit. Thanks for your consideration. My guest today is Mark Horn. Mark is the author of Tarot and the Gates of Light, a Kabbalistic Path to Liberation. Mark has been a lifelong activist in the post-Stonewall LGBTQ movement, starting in the 1970s as a member of both the Gay Liberation Front and the Gay Activist Alliance, as well as serving as chair of Gay and Lesbian Youth of New York. He is the editor and writer of the Stonewall Seder liturgy, a ritual dinner celebrating Jewish LGBTQ Pride, which has been used and adapted by congregations around the United States, Europe, and Australia. He lives on the Upper West Side in New York City, where he is available for private consultation and instruction. Today, Mark and I discuss his book and his journey of discovering the Tarot and Kabbalah. He shares his ways of working with these mysticism traditions as a path of queer liberation and wholeness. Mark also discusses his creation of the Stonewall Seder and how it has grown and evolved over 3 decades. Mark can be reached through his website, gatesoflighttarot.com. Hi, Mark. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So I'm excited to have you here and talk a little bit more about your new book that just came out last year called Tarot and the Gates of Light, a Kabbalistic Path to Liberation. But before we dive into the book, I was wondering if you could share with us a little bit more about how you initially got interested in Kabbalah and Tarot.
Well, Tarot came first when I was 16. I'd already walked away from Judaism. So I was looking for alternate spiritualities. And I was a member of an organization back in the 1960s when I was 16 called the Society for Creative Anachronism, which through medieval tournaments, and I actually met them in the Bay Area at a science fiction convention in Oakland. And one of the science fiction authors there, Marion Zimmer Bradley, gave me a tarot reading. And when she looked at the cards, she said, you know, I think you're supposed to be reading cards yourself based on what this says. And I was really captured by the images. So I was interested in exploring alternate spiritualities. So I asked her, what to do. And she told me which cards to get and what books to read. And from there, I was off. From there, but I spent the next, between the ages of 16 and now 68, reading cards and studying books and working with tarot teachers, because I feel like it's a lifelong study. Even though I've been reading for people since I was 18, you're always learning something new. Mm-hmm. Learned something new about a card just the other night, giving a reading. As I say, and actually when I first got the cards, one of the books was very deep into the Kabbalistic correspondences. But as I say, I'd walked away from Judaism because I knew I was gay when I was 13 years old, and I was not really interested in being any part of any mainstream religion where who I loved and the way I expressed my love was not considered sacred. So mainstream religion was out, but tarot felt like it was something to explore. But Kabbalah seemed like it was part of Judaism. And what's more, everything I read about it in these tarot books was really kind of written in a vague and obscure way, as though it were designed to mystify it rather than to explain it. So I just dropped it. It was not anything I needed to study to really get into tarot. But I spent, the next X number of years of my life, studying different spiritual paths. When I lived in Japan, I got very deeply into Buddhism, but not Japanese Buddhism because, I thought of Zen as a particularly militaristic path, but I came across the Theravadins while I was living in Asia, and I got very deeply into Theravada Buddhism. But the deeper I got into Theravada Buddhism, oddly enough, I had this experience that the Buddhists would say you can't have because the Buddhists don't believe that people have a soul, right? But I felt on a meditation retreat that deep in my soul that I was Jewish and that I needed to explore it more. So when I came back to America, I spoke to a friend of mine, a woman who I'd co-founded the LGBT group on campus with in 1970. And when I read it, the English translation, I said, oh, this reads like meditation instructions. But I don't know anybody who actually would know that these are meditation instructions. And she said, I live in North Carolina, and if I can find rabbis who know it, you live in New York, you certainly can. So I went off in search of rabbis who had a mystical bent and who would accept my queer spirit. And it didn't take me very long to find them. Mm-hmm. So that within a year of sort of coming back into this new embrace of Judaism, I found myself teaching at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which if you had told me this when I was 14 or 40, I would have laughed you out of the room. But there I was. And the more I got into Kabbalah, I began to understand and actually see how it was the structural underpinning of the Torah. And then the more I studied Judaism, there was a holiday, a ritual, a Kabbalistic ritual that I never learned about as a child. But the holiday of Passover, everybody knows this, whether you're Jewish or not. It is, the holiday that sort of observes the freedom of the ancient Israelites from slavery in Egypt. And 50 days after that, there's another holiday, which is also observed in Christianity, although it's observed a little bit differently, called Pentecost, which actually just means 50 days. And between those two periods, there's a Kabbalistic meditation practice that within Judaism you're supposed to do, and that takes you on an inner mythic journey in which you free your own self from slavery, your inner slavery, your spiritual slavery, to the gates of revelation 49 days later, where you are sort of symbolically standing at the foot of Mount Sinai, ready to receive your own revelation. And it's very personal. And I thought, oh, I see how you can do this with tarot cards. So back in it was about 2005 or 6 when I had a blog called Another Queer Jewish Buddhist, because there are lots of queer Jewish Buddhists. I decided I would count the Omer online, since some people do this, and I would do it with the cards. And I didn't do it very regularly, but when I did it, I found it to be a very powerful practice, so that over the years, it actually became my practice. And eventually I realized this would be a very good book, because if I actually shared what I went through on each of these 49 days, because it really is a deep exploration of spirituality and the blocks to experiencing the divine in your life, it would be a template for others to follow. Mm-hmm. And, I really, faced all of my feelings about being in spiritual exile from Judaism. I faced all of my sort of shadow elements within the queer community, my issues around masculinity and femininity, particularly because in Kabbalistic Judaism, the divine, I don't like to use the God word, the divine is beyond gender, right? It is only when we enter the world of duality that is masculine and feminine. And in order to sort of work towards this experience of the divine, you have to integrate this in yourself. So this is a path to do this. And as I did it, I just thought this is something I need to share. So that's sort of what my path was that kind of led me to even getting to the book.
So for people out there who may have heard a little bit about the Kabbalah, but not really know what it is, can you give us a little bit of a nutshell version? Because, I'm sure people are like, well, I've heard of this. I know Madonna used to practice it, that kind of thing, but not really sure exactly what the Kabbalah is and how it does or does not relate to Judaism.
So the Kabbalah is the mystical side of Judaism. Just as, there are Buddhists who only go to Buddhist temples and pray and don't meditate, there are Jews who go to synagogue and who do not do Kabbalistic practices, which include all kinds of meditations. And for centuries, Kabbalistic teachings were kept secret. which is some of the reason why people don't know a lot about it. And it's because people within the tradition thought that having some of this knowledge could be dangerous. And what I mean by that is, because it connects you to certain kinds of energies, if you are not grounded enough to be able to hold these energies, it might kind of blast you away. For example, if you're studying Tantra and you're not sort of really grounded in a way to be able to hold the sexual energy, it will kind of mess you up. Mm-hmm. And in fact, there's a lot about sacred sexuality in Kabbalah. So that, in the centuries before, you had to be married, obviously heterosexual and a man, in order to do this because they wanted you to have some place to put all of this sexual energy. And in fact, for the Kabbalists, sort of male-female sex was a sort of an essential component to experiencing the inner union of the masculine and feminine. Now, all of this, in the last 100 years has seen lots of tumult as queer people have really, entered this world, so that it has been interpreted in ways that are more congruent with an experience of queer spirituality. And in fact, that I find very powerful and very moving.
Great. And so what are these gates of light that you speak of?
So in the Kabbalah, there is this symbol, a glyph, called the Tree of Life. And it is a kind of a diagram of how all energy moves in the universe, how it moves down from the divine no thing, the thing that is beyond everything, into materiality, and how that energy sort of goes through what we'll call a series of step-down transformers, so that each of us are able to experience this energy without getting blasted out. And this diagram, the Tree of Life, it has 10 what are called sephirot. We'll call them nodes. And between the sephirot are 22 paths. And interestingly, each of these are considered gates of light because any of these paths or nodes are ways in to experience the light of the divine. And you can go in from any direction, but ultimately you have to pass through all of them.
And so how, you talked a little bit about how for you this book is a path towards queer spirituality or queer liberation in a way. How might a queer person use these particular practices specifically towards them? Because I think that I read a little bit about the book and I didn't see anything particularly geared towards queer people in the book, like it's for anyone to use. But since, this is kind of the topic of the podcast,
of course,
when we live in these queer worlds, I'm curious to know like how you bring this into your own experience of your queer spirituality.
So one of the things, as I was explaining, the gates of light are these sephirot and these paths, because each of the tarot cards corresponds to one of these sephirot or one of these paths. Working with the images on these cards is a way of activating these energies within you. And because I did this and wrote about my experience, I reveal and talk about in the book how I dealt with issues of sexuality that came up during the process. So, for example, there is a card called the Five of Pentacles. And the image on the card in the most popular deck, the Waite-Smith deck, shows two beggars, one who is a leper, one who is poor and without shoes, outside in the snow. And outside in the snow in front of what seems to be a church, but that has no doorway to get in. And one of the things this is about spiritual exile. So it is about growing up knowing that you have a spirituality, but somehow feeling exiled from a mainstream religion. What keeps you outside? But also, at the same time, it is an investigation and a questioning for yourself and for me, as I was doing it. What do I believe is unacceptable about me that makes me unable to stand in the full light of the divine? What do I have to leave out in order to be in the divine light? And part of the teaching of this card is that you're not supposed to leave anything outside. If you leave something outside, that's the beggar and the leper. You have exiled these parts of yourself. So whether you grew up as a Christian and you believed you couldn't be gay in order to be loved by God, or Jewish for the same reason, or whether you are queer and spiritual, but believe you can't bring how spiritual you are into queer community because that's not acceptable. It's what is not acceptable in your life so that you are unable to be a whole person. And there are lots of cards which are sort of doorways into this psycho-spiritual exploration. There's another card in the deck, the Nine of Wands. And I was doing a reading for a young man a number of years ago, a guy I did not know. And the Nine of Wands came up in the reading. And the image on the card is a man who has his head is bandaged, and he's holding a staff, and he's standing in front of what looks like a little stockade of staves, wands sticking up out of the ground, as though he's defending himself against something. Except there's a little space that he can go through, and in fact, there is no enemy on the other side. And the position of this card, and where it was in relation to other cards, led me to turn to him and say, "Are you in the closet about being gay?" And he burst into tears, because it in fact was exactly what the reading was about. And for me, the Nine of Wands is about feeling like there's something about yourself that you have to defend, that you are in the closet about. And for him, it was about sexuality. For many of us, at different parts of our lives, it was about sexuality. And because as queer people, for those of us who quote unquote pass in sort of mainstream society, in order to be seen, we actually have to announce ourselves. So that in some ways, coming out of the closet is a daily experience. And so this is a card which is important for us to look at as a way of saying, what is your relationship every time that you walk into a new situation where you have to announce yourself? Are you feeling the old defenses? Or are you feeling like you can walk through that wall of staves to the clear space on the other side because you know you're accepted, right? So there are all kinds of ways of working with the cards to investigate your relationship to your queer self and to the divine spirit.
I really appreciate that. I've been talking with a few people lately about this idea of feeling comfortable with ourselves as a queer person, but this idea of passing either as straight or for people who are maybe, transgender or non-binary, they may appear as something to the outside world, but they want people to know, like what their proper pronouns are, or what their history is around their experience around their gender. And they want people to know that. They don't want to be that part of themselves to be erased. And it can be really challenging to do that. So I like that you're bringing that forward through, or that these cards are bringing this forward for us.
Yeah, no, they really provide, even though these are, many people look at this deck and they think, oh, it's traditional. These images are from the 19th century. But I think they all show universal spiritual principles that we can all gain access to.
Mm-hmm. And so with the ritual of Omer or Omer, how do you instruct people to use the tarot? Is it like a card a day or a reading a day for the 49 days? Or
actually 2 cards. The way the Omer ritual works is that between Passover and Pentecost, there are 7 weeks. Each week has 7 days. And on the Tree of Life, there are 10 Sephirot, but in this period, we work only with the lower 7, so that each week we work with one of the Sephirot, that is the Sephirah of the week, and then with one of the cards which represents the Sephirah of that day. And so it's very structured. And you're always working with 2 Sephirotic energies and see how they interrelate. And together, they open up a facet of your life and your spirituality. So that every day, with each of these pairs, you find yourself with a series of questions. They really pose questions, different questions for all of us. I mean, in the book, I put the questions that came up for me, but I really invite everybody to, investigate the cards and see what questions are posed for them. And because for me, the journey is different every year. I do this every year. And each year I find that, the questions are different because I'm in a different place. Mm-hmm. But each day you have a different pair of cards, and they take you through each of the Sephirotic energies so that you are gradually clearing out any blocks. Think of it as working with your 7 chakras, because in fact, the Sephirot actually align with the chakras. So what you're doing is you're clearing out the energies in this part of your psycho-spiritual body so that on the 50th day, you've built a stronger container so that you're able to hold more light. with your own experience of revelation. And I want to bring up another guest who you mentioned earlier, Andrew Raymer, who was on the program, I guess, a couple of years ago. He wrote a lovely little piece called Standing at Sinai, which is about the 50th day and about his experience on the 50th day and receiving his revelation, and how the revelation he received was about all different kinds of love being holy and what the role of a queer person is in the spiritual ecology of humanity and the planet. And this is the kind of thing that I think can come to you when you do this work.
Lovely. And you mentioned earlier that you brought a little bit of Buddhism into this practice as well?
Oh, yes.
How does that tie in?
So I'm a spiritual vagabond, right? As many of us have been, because we went outside of the tradition of our birth. And so all of that shows up in the book, because my feeling is all of these traditions and all of these paths are different maps to get you to a certain place. And they're different pathways to have you experience the reality that is beyond maps. And so I like to use bits and pieces from all of these traditions to help sort of break through any prejudices we might have about seeing other ways of getting there. And also as a way of helping to open up somebody who might be coming to this book who isn't Jewish, and they say, I don't know that I can connect with this, but there's just as much Christian scripture in there as Jewish. There are quotes from the Dhammapada and the Jataka tales in Buddhism. There are quotes from the Sufi masters, because, as I say, they're all different maps to the same reality.
Great. Well, I really enjoy this whole model and this idea of working in this way, and I hope that people will maybe check it out and give it a try and see what kinds of ways they can bring more light into themselves.
The only thing I want to say about it is, of course, people do it traditionally between Passover and Pentecost. And actually the Christian holiday of Pentecost, when the apostles received the tongues of fire that enabled them to speak. That's the Christian version of the revelation that you can get. But people I know have done this at many different times of the year. People who got it last January started immediately and reported amazing results 49 days later. So you can do it at any time, but if you do it when everybody else on the planet is doing it, I think you're picking up the power of a morphic field, and you'll have a stronger experience.
So speaking of annual traditions, I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about something else that you have developed in correlation with or correspondence with Andrew Raymer, who you just mentioned, who is also a previous guest on the podcast, which is the Stonewall Seder. So I wonder if you could share a little bit about the history of that and how that has evolved with us.
So back in the 90s, I met some members of the Aquarian Minyan, which is out of the Bay Area, and they had a 5-page document about a kind of a queer Seder that they did, which was around Passover. And I looked at it and I thought, I wanted to adapt this for my synagogue community in New York, bring Kabbalistic intelligence to it so that it would be about unifying the inner male and female and unifying in the spiritual ecology all different gender expressions and ways of loving in a ritual that was not unlike the Passover ritual, but happens the weekend of Pride in June. And even though I went to a mainstream synagogue, they agreed. And I adapted and rewrote this text. And we did it for a number of years. And I shared it with Andrew, who was a friend. And he then adapted it with someone else at his community in the Bay Area and sent me what he did. And so we started sending versions back and forth to each other, almost as kind of a spiritual dialogue between communities, where we would influence each other doing this ritual as we went through it each year separately. And this last year, because of course no one was able to do it together in the Bay Area, it was done virtually online. And I was very pleased that I was invited to be part of it as one of the creators. So it was very moving, and it's an extraordinary experience. I'll tell you something that happened. So you were talking about spiritual exile or feeling something that is unacceptable. One of the parts of this ritual, the Stonewall Seder, is going around the table of people you're sitting in and talking about what you feel is unacceptable to God about yourself. if you are willing to be that intimate. And at a table that I was at sometime in the 90s, there was a national politician who was sitting at the table who said 5 words about himself. He said, "I'm blah, 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 blah." The entire table went silent. It was the most intimate thing he could have possibly said. And it brought him into a spiritual closeness with everybody at the table that it completely transformed what everybody else said and was willing to share. And the bravery, the spiritual courage of that man has stayed with me to this day. So that when I see him speaking on the national stage, I always hold that the vulnerability that he showed in that moment in my heart, knowing the place that he's coming from.
And traditionally, what is the purpose of the Seder or the function of the Seder?
So, because as LGBTQ people, we grew up without a sense of the way we express our gender or our sexuality as sacred. This is a ritual which recognizes how sacred, in fact, it is. Mm-hmm. It brings it into the house so that anybody who's there, a queer or not, feels the full power of the divine in how we express our love.
Great. And when you do the Stonewall Seder, do you have a empty chair maybe a queer ancestor or something like that, the way that...
Well, actually, one of the guests at the very first Seder we had was a German man who had been a patient of Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld and who had escaped Germany just before the Nazis had come to power and had lived on the Upper West Side of Manhattan for the rest of his life. But he was a link to these queer ancestors. There's a section of the Seder which is about the people that were lost in the Holocaust and how this was sort of silence. This was an earlier silence equals death. There's a section about all of the people that we've lost to HIV. Mm-hmm. There are sections which represent, all of the women who were condemned as witches in earlier times because they lived outside the patriarchy. Right? So that there are many ways to sort of re-sacralize the folks who are part of our spiritual ancestry, to recognize their pain and to feel it as part of our own and our history, and then move forward with it as sacred.
It's interesting to hear you talk about this because a few years ago, well, more than a few years ago, a friend of mine who is of Jewish heritage invited me and a couple other gay guys over to his house, and he called it the Gay Seder. And we had our own version of, a Seder, whereas, there were maybe like 5 of us there and only 2 of them were of Jewish heritage. So, it was their own way of finding something and creating a new spirituality for themselves. So I'm glad that this exists also as a way for, anyone to participate and have that practice too.
The text is actually downloadable. There's a link to it on my tarot site, which is gatesoflighttarot.com. Eventually you'll find the link which goes to the Stonewall Seder. But you can and I'm sure there's a link on the synagogue that Andrew is connected with in Share, not remembering the name. Mm-hmm. But there are many texts available. It's been done in Australia and in the Netherlands. So there are different versions of this text flying around, and I urge people to take it and make it your own, because this is a tradition which is evolving, and we all need to bring our voices to it. And by doing that, we make our voices part of the sacred conversation of our ancestors.
Yeah. Well, I also think, that's kind of what you've been doing with all the stuff we've been talking about. You've taken it and made it your own, and that's kind of the queer way, is we take something and we make it our own. If you're going to push us out, then we're going to take it and make it our own.
And in fact, so one of the things I am, besides all of this, is I do storytelling. And in the archetype of the great story, the hero goes off, finds something, and brings it back to heal the community. And I believe that this is part of what our job as queer people is to do. Mm-hmm. We're often the child that is thrown out, has to go on the journey, finds the elixir, and brings it back to heal the entire society, and healing ourselves in the process.
Yeah. So, Mark, I wonder if you can share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish.
It's kind of an oddly traditional. It's a Kabbalistic practice. It was taught by Rebbe Nachman, lived a couple of 100 years ago, although it's extremely contemporary, since many people do it, not knowing that this is in fact something that comes out of Hasidic Judaism. I go into a forest, which in New York City means I go to Central Park. And there is a particular tree in Central Park that I have a connection to. And I go and I sit under that tree, or I face that tree, and I pour out my heart. I say everything aloud that I want to say to the divine. Everything that I'm scared of, everything that I love, everything that I think I need, all of my, I think is an illusion. And I ask for freedom from these illusions, and I ask for greater light. And I ask for a connection to the source of all creation, which trees are in fact a representative of, because they reach deep into the earth and up into the sky, which is why the Kabbalistic symbol is in fact a tree.
Great. It's funny you should mention that, and we keep referencing Andrew because that was something he talked about, not that particular practice, but about how his connection to his own sexuality and spirituality and his relationship to trees. So anyone listening to this should go back and listen to Andrew's episode as well. So, yeah. Well, Mark, thank you for being here and sharing about your work. Can you let people know where they can find you and learn more about your book?
So you can go, my website is gatesoflighttarot.com. There's a Facebook page. So if you go to Facebook/Tarot Gates, you'll find me. Or, at Gates of Light Tarot on Instagram. Or just my name, Mark Horn and Tarot, in the Google machine. Mm-hmm. And I'll come up in a lot of places. And
they can get your book through your website?
Yes, there is a link on the website that takes you to bookshop.org, so that you will be supporting an independent bookseller rather than that strange corporation named for a river in South America.
Got it. All right. Well, I will have the links in the show notes as well, so people can find them there. Well, thank you again for being here.
Thank you. It was an honor to be part of this illustrious group of interviewees.
To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. And if you enjoyed the show, remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. This will help us reach and support more queer people all over. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.